Welcome to UCC's Global Speaker Series. We're delighted to be joined by UCC alumni and friends who are tuning in from around the world, and also we welcome all of you who are joining us here on campus. UCC's Global Speaker Series brings together experts from the alumni community with specialists from UCC to discuss topics of contemporary interest and to explore some of the opportunities and challenges facing our world today. We would especially like to thank Deloitte, who are the sponsors of UCC's Global Speaker Series. This evening, we'll explore some of the implications of the policy changes being implemented by the new US administration and what they will mean for Ireland and Europe. We welcome our expert speakers, Mike O'Sullivan and Professor Andrew Cottey, who will be introduced to you shortly by Professor Ursula Kilkelly. Professor Kilkelly is UCC's VP for Global Engagement and a highly accomplished researcher in the area of human rights. Welcome, Ursula.
Thank you, Karen, and good evening, everybody, both joining us online and a very large group of interested people here in the room. It's a great pleasure for me to chair this evening's debate. It is just over a month since Donald Trump took up his office as the 47th President of the United States, and it's safe to say in that short time we've seen an unprecedented wave of executive orders domestically and political and public announcements internationally that have upended much of our previous views and orthodoxies in relation to a whole range of matters relating to trade, to geopolitics, to international diplomacy and beyond. And this evening we have with us two people who will be no stranger to those of you who've tuned in to our speaker series in the past, but who are perfectly placed to help us tease out and hopefully understand the implications of Donald Trump's presidency from the perspective of Ireland and Europe. Mike O'Sullivan, to my far left, is a UCC and Oxford graduate, is an economist and a commentator on finance and geopolitical matters. In particular, although very well published and written more generally, is author of The Levelling, an excellent blog that issues every Sunday morning if you haven't tuned into it. Really excellent analysis of all of these issues in the post-globalised world. Among his many accomplishments, so Mike is author of Ireland and the Global Question, which he published in 2006, a book which really still resonates and which we particularly mark as Cork University Press celebrates 100 years this year. We also then are joined by Professor Andrew Cottey, professor in our Department of Government and Politics here at UCC, an expert in international politics and international relations and strategic studies in particular. Andrew's research focuses on European security, including NATO and the European Union, China and European relations with Asia, and civil-military relations and the role of the armed forces. And his books include Security in 21st Century Europe and Understanding Chinese Politics and Introduction to Government in the People's Republic of China, among other publications. So I'm really delighted to welcome both Mike and Andrew for this evening's discussion. If I could open up by asking you both to reflect perhaps on what we have seen in what might be described as Trump's world, what has emanated from Trump's world since the President took office on the 20th of January. Andrew, I'll start with you.
Great, thanks very much, Ursula. So I think, one thing, I'll maybe begin by quoting Steve Bannon, who a name people might recognise, a former kind of advisor to President Trump, and he used the phrase muzzle velocity, as in bullets coming out from a rifle or a shotgun. And in a sense, I think the kind of overwhelming slew of executive orders, decisions, policies, and so on is actually part of the strategy of the Trump administration and the new kind of MAGA movement in America to overwhelm, in a sense, political opposition domestically and to some extent also internationally. So, this isn't just random chance. This is by design. The aim was to come in and throw out an overwhelming range of things that would disrupt the status quo in lots of ways, but also potentially overwhelm political opposition. And then maybe just the second thing I think I would say is just to take a step back. And I do think we're in, a fundamentally different world from the post-1945 world. And I've reminded of the phrase world turned upside down, which is actually a title from a song way back in the English Civil War, for anyone who knows any English or British history. But I think two things. For the first time since at least 1945, and in fact, maybe since the 1860s, we have to consider the possibility that America may no longer be a democracy. I wouldn't say that the United States is not a democracy today, but the possibility that democracy could be very seriously eroded is there. And then secondly, I think, the US now, under the Trump administration, views other states, allies and partners, adversaries, in a radically different way from anything that we've seen so far. And, people will have seen just in the last 24, 48 hours, for the first time, we saw the United States in the UN General Assembly voting with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea, and against the member states of the European Union, Japan, Canada, Australia. And that really, symbolises the scale of the shift in US foreign policy. So I think I'll stop by way of introductory remarks there and maybe
thanks, Andrew. Pass over to Mike.
Thanks both, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. So when I was a student in UCC, it was also a momentous time. We had the fall of communism, we had German unification, we've had a consequential German election this weekend. And go back in history, and Helmut Kohl in 1990, when he heralded unification, one of the things he did in a very pointed way was to thank America for its role in Europe and its role in bringing the two Germanys together. And if you look at the immediate reaction of Friedrich Merz this weekend, you see that the world has been turned upside down at a dizzying speed. And it may seem far away for us in Cork and Ireland, but from 1990 onwards, Ireland, our economy, our society, changed dramatically, changed the most in hundreds of years. And it was changed by globalization, by the arrival of American multinationals, America's involvement in the peace process, and our own path through Europe. And a lot of that is unraveling, and we don't yet feel it, but it will begin to impact us. And I think, unfortunately, Ireland is suffering, like many other countries, what I would call a diplomatic crash. And what I mean by that, it's a bit like a stock market investor. You invest in all these companies, and then you come in on a Tuesday morning, and the value is cratered by 20 or 30%. And we have been good global citizens. We've invested in democracy, invested in a close relationship with America, in the rules of the international world. We've invested carefully and heavily in ideas like two-state solution, and they've all been thrown out the window in the last couple of weeks. So our diplomacy, if you like, is at sea, and we haven't been good diplomatic investors in other ways. We have the weakest defence and security framework in Europe and across many countries. We're guilty of what Sean Foylon, a Cork man, called the green shroud, putting the green shroud around Ireland and isolating ourselves from the consequences of international events. And unfortunately, we're now in a wake-up moment and we're not prepared for it.
And if I could go to you, Andrew, picking up something that you just got in reference to the beginning, and that's the potential risk or threat to democracy in the United States. We'll come back to some of those wider international diplomatic and political consequences in a moment. But focusing on the democratic deficit that appears to be emerging through the United States at the moment, how How real is that threat in your view? As a political scientist, you're best placed to advise what we're seeing.
I think it's very real. I mean, we have to see. Time will tell. I mean, I think to sort of throw in a few bits of political science. Firstly, I think we can think about liberal democracy. So, democracy, as we generally understand it, isn't just elections. The winner takes everything, and damn the losers, damn the minority, as it were. Democracy is elections, winners, but also protections for the losers, protections for minorities, so rule of law, separation of powers, independent institutions. And Trump and the MAGA Republicans, in simple terms, don't believe in that. They think, if we've won, I can do what I want. And I mean, in addition, then obviously you have the fact that the Republicans now control both the House and the Senate. The Republican Party is supine, I think you could reasonably say, in terms of President Trump. We have a hard right Republican majority on the Supreme Court. So I think there is a real danger of erosions of American democracy, and the kind of countries, obviously, which people talk about in particular are Hungary under Viktor Orban, and the direction that Poland was going in under law and justice. And maybe just to give one example, and again, we don't yet know how this will play out, but recently, I think towards the end of the year, there were Supreme Court elections in North Carolina. The incumbent Republican was defeated by a Democrat. That Republican is now seeking to have that election result overturned in the court because they claim there were fraudulent votes and so on. Imagine that kind of scenario in the next presidential election in 2028. So I think there is a real danger, not that America will turn into Nazi Germany in 1933 or 1937, but that we could see what people call an electoral autocracy, a serious erosion of democracy, and many serious scholars of these issues would take this view and are deeply concerned about this.
And can I just stay with that point for a minute, and I'll come to Mike afterwards, in terms of the pronouncements that Trump has made, for instance, with respect to Zelensky in Ukraine, calling him a dictator, the alliances that we're now seeing with countries that would not be associated with the rule of law and democracy, and certainly don't operate the kind of checks and balances we would expect in a liberal democracy. Is that something that is part of this whole journey or process? Or is that a separate international, forging of allegiances internationally?
Well, I think there is a connection in that President Trump sees himself as a strongman. He likes the idea of being a strongman, and I think he tweeted something which referenced Napoleon, I think, recently, and this was kind of, and he wasn't treating it in the sense of it being a negative. So for him, he admires Putin, he admires Xi Jinping, he seemed even to admire Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and he sees himself in that vein. So there is that connection between the domestic, the need for the strong man who's in charge, can solve the country's problems, can solve the world's problems. And I think, in my view, that's part of Donald Trump's mindset, and that's part of what's going on.
Yeah, extraordinary to see the level of influence that personality and personality type has on behaviours and the worldview ultimately. But Mike, and I'm going to come to you on the similar kind of question.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Andrew has said, but I'll approach the question from two different angles. So one, just to go back to the idea of globalization, we've had this 30 or 40 year period of prosperity, low inflation, no major wars, and that's being torn asunder. And it was torn asunder by events like the first Trump presidency, Brexit, the implications of COVID. And this Trump presidency is the first attempt, I think, to frame and to start to build a kind of a new world order. We're evolving towards a sort of a multipolar world order of China, Europe, the States, maybe the greater Middle East, Asia. But this is a really coherent approach to do that. And I think what people miss a little bit is that there's a plan behind it, and that there are a lot more people than Trump. There are people from wealthy families in the private equity industry, other powerful families in America, etc., who are aligning themselves with Trump. Just look at the behavior of the big social media companies. So there is something, coherent behind this, and there is a vision of prosecuting this for at least 12, maybe 16 years as a method and as a sort of a political agenda. And I think we are distracted by the day-to-day, minute-by-minute chaos. And so we should read this as part of a bigger plan. So that's the first point. The second one is that, like Ireland, America is a democracy, but it's also a republic. And what makes, if you go back to your Plato, what makes republics great are things like institutions, laws, educated, impartial elites. And America is a great financial power, and everything he is doing, he seems to be taking from the economic textbook of Turkey, for example. If you look at what Erdogan has done in the last 7 or 8 years, where you effectively devalue the republic, you put teachers in jail, you wither away the institutions, you put the judges in jail. So in some respects, none of this bodes well for America. And America is at a point where American assets are 70% of financial markets. It's already economically massively unequal. It can become more unequal in terms of the power distribution, and this will also have big implications for the economy. If we as consumers, investors, etc., lose confidence with the dollar, American companies, and there's a well-known economist, Barry Eichengreen in Stanford, who went right back in history and looked at empires and looked at their currencies. And basically from the moment when the empire begins to fade, the currency begins to fade. And the dollar today is probably the most overvalued it's been in decades. So he's starting kind of from the wrong place.
And can I ask about the connection, before we move out to the foreign policy, the connection that you referenced there to corporate America? We're all familiar with the tech bros, the Elon Musk, the Zuckerbergs, the Jeff Bezos influence, and the extent to which they've very quickly aligned with the presidency of Donald Trump. But also we see corporate America very quickly follow the denigration of the EDI agenda, for instance, and I think that while some might have understood or expected that from President Trump's administration, I think the extent to which the corporate world followed suit was, I think, more of a shock. So, can you unpack that for us a little bit in terms of the wins for corporate America that are clearly being weighed in the balance here in the way these significant parts of corporate America followed suit on those agendas?
So it unfortunately teaches us to be very cynical. And we will be even more cynical in a few weeks and months' time. I'll give you. I mean, we saw each other last in Paris at a UCC event, and it was around the time of the AI summit, and a lot of the US social media companies were there lobbying European regulators to basically to lower their guard, and they see themselves projecting their businesses across the world on the back of Trump. And I think there may be two watchwords for the Trump presidency in terms of how they think and operate. So one is exceptionalism, and then the other is isolationism. And everything he's doing is being built on areas where America is exceptional. So there's probably three: corporates, dominant corporates, finance, and the military. And if you look at all the pressure points that we have in Europe, those are the ones he's pushing really, really hard. And I think their vision is that America is going to be maybe not so much be more isolated, but more aloof from the rest of the world. But there's a very strong economic driver to this. And we're at a point in world history where uniquely all of the world's major economies are heavily indebted. You know, debt to GDP in Japan is 300%. It's probably the same in China, but they won't tell us. France, Britain have 100% debt to GDP, the same in the States. So there is a bubbling under, there's a competitive race to lower debt and to ease fiscal deficits. And so that is part of the serious rationale in terms of getting Europe to spend more on defence. And then in the background, people are talking about an idea which we can explore later called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which is a kind of grand financial accord to basically take the weight off the balance sheet of the US government and shift it to other countries.
Andrew?
I mean, I think just on the kind of tech bros and finance and you know, multinational companies, I think there are maybe, I'd say 2 or 3 things going on. One, I think there are some who are true believers. So amongst Elon Musk, another name which people may know is Peter Thiel, some of those people are really kind of radical libertarians, radical anti-government. So they really want, you know, a minimal government, and that partly aligns with you know, what's happening on. And then secondly, I think on the more cynical side, there are those who are simply, okay, well, you know, ultimately our job is to do what's best for our company, what's best for the balance sheet of our company and our shareholders. And if that means working with the Trump administration, that's what they'll do. Whether that's sensible and whether that's, as some critics would argue, even short-sighted from a pure kind of, you know, business self-interest point of view is another question. So I think there's a number of different things going on in terms of kind of business, multinational companies, the tech bros and all of that.
And if we move out then to foreign policy more broadly, Andrew, on the alliances that are being forged, on the various bargaining tools and chips that are being used in that context, what's your assessment of that?
So, I mean, I think for me, if you want to understand Donald Trump, he sees the world, whether it's the world of domestic politics or the world of international relations, in terms of self-interest, in terms of power, and in terms of bargaining. And you see that playing out in, you know, very, you know, straightforward terms. So, you know, he sees if there are small countries, weaker countries, we can bully them effectively. Panama, Colombia. And then in terms of, you know, the long-standing allies, he doesn't really see them as allies. I mean, you know, Europe is a drain on America's resources. The European Union is an economic competitor to the United States. So, you know, to the extent that he can, Donald Trump would probably like to ditch the allies. And then the other category is the what we call the former adversaries, North Korea, China, Russia. And again, if you think about Donald Trump, you know, his book was The Art of the Deal. So he thinks that he's the man who can cut a deal with these other authoritarian powers. And we see that playing out in Ukraine. The one point which I think, you know, a number of observers make is that actually Donald Trump doesn't seem to be very good at this kind of deal making. And, you know, the biggest example from the first administration would be North Korea and Kim Jong-un. You know, he had his negotiations, he had his summits with Kim Jong-un. You know, Donald Trump's letters from Kim Jong-un are apparently among his most treasured possessions. But the negotiations with North Korea actually produced virtually nothing. And here we are, you know, 10 years later, and North Korea's nuclear arsenal is bigger and North Korea's missile arsenal is bigger. So Donald Trump's self-image, you know, of himself is as the great deal maker. I think the evidence actually doesn't suggest a very strong case for that.
And your perspective on that, Mike?
It's not a rational approach, because everything he's doing is tearing up and rendering asunder what America, its diplomats, its companies have worked for in the last 70 years. His approach is that of transactions, not relationships, and it looks clever and daring, and he's managed to throw sand in the face of his adversaries or his allies, his former allies and friends, in the first couple of weeks. But I do think that within a couple of months we will begin to see the effects of this, probably in financial markets, because that's people are very, very sensitive to this. So If you look at Tesla, for example, Tesla sales across Europe are dropping by 60, 70%. The dollar is beginning to weaken. The stock market is now coming down to where it was before he was elected. So I think the reverberations of this are beginning to be felt already.
I mean, is that not quite reasons to be hopeful, but is there, in terms of the what might check the power of Donald Trump as president? I understand both the opinion polls and stock markets are the two KPIs, I suppose he may look to to judge his own performance, and if those start, and clearly he's doing very well in public opinion, there's no evidence that has had a negative impact, and so the question of how the stock market reacts is likely to be pertinent then.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we maybe miss is that through the Obama presidency, the Biden presidency, and actually thanks in part to Trump's first presidency, the American elite became highly sensitive to China as a competitor. So I think go back to when Obama became president, China was seen as a partner, maybe a slightly inferior country to America, and now it's very much a competitor, and it is baked into the minds of CEOs, of people in the State Department, the military, that they are in this intense competition with China, and I would always feel whenever I left Europe and you go to the Middle East and you meet Americans and Chinese, kind of one going out of a meeting with a minister and the others going in, that intense competition is very, very present, and it hasn't gone away. And I think people will begin to have really profound worries about that in the next couple of months.
And if we take the specific challenges of the analysis to Europe, what do you see as the particular issues there?
So I think maybe going back about 8 months, I think Europe has totally lost control of the narrative, the global narrative. And maybe from last May, there was a view going around on Twitter and newspapers that America innovates, China copies, and Europe regulates. To the extent now that I think people in Brussels and beyond and Paris are just sick of that. But we don't have the same style of politicians in Europe that the Americans have. Maybe Macron is close, even though he's suffering at home. So Europe needs to take control of the narrative and get beyond it and stop reacting to Trump. So that's one thing that's very important. The other is that somehow having disabled the American political apparatus, Russia is still a big threat to Europe. And there's plenty of examples of Russian sabotage of freight airliners, assassinations across Europe by Russia. And even though there's a lot of talk about defense, I think security, to distinguish between the two, is probably more important. So that's things like cyber, counter-espionage across Europe. There are probably too many Russians circulating in Europe, and European governments need to make a very, very firm call on that. So I think security for me is a much more live threat, and it's the same for Ireland, than defence and than buying rockets and transport aircraft, which will come, and it seems like there's a political willingness to do that. And then the final thing is finance and investment. There are no votes in Capital Markets Union. You won't go knocking on a door up in Blarney Street and say, vote for Capital Markets Union. But politicians have to translate that into different language, which is the language of jobs and of security. And it's one of the areas where Europe is very, very weak compared to the States.
And Andrew, from your perspective, particularly looking at defence and security perspectives for Europe.
Yeah, I think Mike has a very good point that security is more than defence, and a lot of the threats are, as he said, things like cyber, electoral interference, misinformation, and so on, and we're very poor at countering those. And we were just discussing beforehand, if you take something like disinformation, Finland is top of the class in terms of responding to that. So for a number of years now, Finland has had school-age digital education for children to sort of make them or enable them to be adequate digital citizens and deal with this cyber world. And Ireland, as an example, is behind on that. But Ireland is not unique. There are many European countries which are behind on that. So that whole kind of cyber digital sphere in a security sense, and countering Russian activities. And then perhaps just briefly on the defence bit, we've had 75 years of depending on America, and trying to switch that overnight is very hard. So it's just a real challenge. But interesting maybe to look to the Nordic, Baltic countries. If you look at that in terms of subsea cables and pipelines and so on in the Baltic Sea, the Nordic Baltic states have effectively taken charge of that very largely without America. So they have a new NATO operation which doesn't involve America. They have a whole range of activities and stuff. So they're showing in a very concrete way that they have a problem in their neighbourhood, and they can step up and take action without depending on the United States. So the defence bit is hard, but it's not impossible, I think, would be my sort of take.
And is that behind the new German perspective, I suppose, on the repositioning of NATO in that kind of context? Is that where that vision comes from, of a NATO without the United States?
Yeah, I think it was Jean Monnet said, one of the founders of the EU said that Europe needs a crisis to move forward, which I think is largely true. And after the Eurozone financial crisis, Europe has become not quite fully made financially, but it's taken a number of steps forward. And this will create basically a European or an EU defence and security platform that will extend into areas like migration, the purchase of joint equipment to be used across countries, the issuance of European defence debt that's coming in a few weeks, effectively. And I think Friedrich Merz is very interesting because he speaks like Macron. And the German-French locomotive, as they say, is really the driving force of Europe, and that hasn't been in action, hasn't had momentum in the last probably 10 years, even under Merkel and Macron. So that would be a new driving force. And beyond that, then, there is a power shift in Europe in the last 4 or 5 years away from Ireland to the Baltic states, maybe Poland as well, and a bit to Italy. And we're now in a position where we will have to learn from these other countries. And our natural reaction in this country is to look to Britain as an example, which I think is not pertinent. I mean, we need to look at the Scandinavian countries who have changed on a dime. 2 of them were neutral. Sweden, Finland, they're now not neutral. They both have relatively huge armies. Estonia, when it left the orbit of Russia, totally remade its armed services with the help of Canada and the States. So there's lots of examples out there for us to look at. But make no mistake, we are a European country, and we will be drawn into this and have to play a role.
And can I just tease out with you where the role of Britain is in this? Because we had become used to Ireland being one of, obviously, an important English-speaking country within the EU post-Brexit, and that had changed the context, the dynamic to a certain extent about Ireland's role in Europe. But it seems, certainly to me, in the last number of weeks, if not months, since Keir Starmer's election success, that Britain have very much positioned themselves as part of this, certainly talking about they talk about themselves and together with the French as the 2 defence countries of Europe, and this will fall to them, and talking about the peace campaign in Ukraine, for instance. So where does this leave the relationship with Britain and Britain's role in Europe, you think?
So I actually think the case of Britain is incredibly interesting, because it's sort of after Brexit, it's been caught offside by all these big zones, and they've been trying to kind of float off and do their own thing. And actually, the day that Brexit was finalised, on that day, just by coincidence, the British and French navies held their biggest and closest military naval exercise ever, Operation Griffin, I think it was called. So they have always, in the last 20 years, been very close militarily in terms of security, and they are getting closer. And I think to his credit, Keir Starmer and the people around them, the heads of the British Army, have been really quite ballsy, actually, in terms of the diplomacy, in terms of the commitment to defence. So I don't think Britain is going to reverse Brexit, but I think it would be part of a pan-European defence security shield. Does that make it more easy or difficult for us? I actually think in 5 or 10 years' time, we will have to jointly with Britain patrol our part of the world in terms of the seas and the airspace.
Yeah, interesting perspective. So
maybe just briefly to come in, I mean, just in terms of the challenges for the Irish Defence Forces in Ireland on this, I've worked closely with the Defence Forces and know many Defence Forces personnel, including at senior level. I have a huge degree of sympathy for them because they're put in a very difficult political situation. Mike's absolutely right. If you think about Russian Navy, subsea cables, Ireland can't do that on its own. It needs to do it and contribute, but it needs to do it with those. And obviously the UK will be first in those. But even the most minor of naval cooperation activities between the Irish Naval Service and the Royal Navy, 2 ships passing at sea, which is kind of normal, has to be referred back to the Department of Defence in Kildare, I was going to say Dublin, and referred on to the Minister and may or may not be approved and so on. So the politics of this is really challenging, actually, for the Irish military, and there needs to be a culture change because of course the history between Ireland and Britain has been troubled for reasons that we all know very well. But in the end, they're still economically intertwined, 2 neighbours, 2 democracies with common interests. So as Mike says, I mean, I think the case for Britain and Ireland with others, France, Norway, and so on, cooperating on naval and air and so on is overwhelming, but it's politically very challenging.
And I think we in this country, we are on the verge of a huge defence shock. And what I mean by that, so our peer militaries would be Denmark and Norway, and they have about 90 vessels each in their navies, about 70, 80 jets, and per capita we would have an army of say 25,000 or so. Now we're down to about 6,000 or so, and we treat our military, our soldiers, people in our navy, incredibly badly in this country in terms of how they are equipped and how they are paid. And to get to where Denmark or Norway are, if you do the math, we will have to spend probably 20 billion a year for the next 10 years. And we're now talking about adding maybe another 500 million or something. And that's useless. So it's useless saying we'll spend another 1 or 2 billion. It has to be a total blue sky project. The good thing is that we don't have much of a military infrastructure in the country. And that means a lot of the infrastructure is not redundant because the military technology, if you look at what companies like Anduril, who do make unmanned underwater vehicles in the States, or Helsing AI in Germany do with drones, that's changing so quickly. It's actually better to start from scratch in some respects.
And even converting I think it's the 3.5% on defence spending that's been discussed as the sort of benchmark with Britain and the European countries, converting that number into productive spend into actual industry generated arms and weapons effectively requires and will suggest an enormous shift in how economies are functioning, and how in industry is innovating, and all of that, and that universities researching. These are huge questions which are probably lost in the sense of a percentage of GDP, which seems a rather abstract notion, so I think that's something that no doubt will come back in very real terms. But focusing on Ireland and our relationship, our particularly important and intertwined relationship with the United States, we've historical, obviously close ties, but also trade very significant dependencies. We have, I believe, the 5th largest surplus, a trade surplus with of the United States. So and with reviews of those relationships and the implications of tariffs looming for April, where do you see that Ireland, and not only Ireland, but Cork being particularly exposed in this context? So what are the risks for Ireland and ultimately for Cork in all of that?
Yes, so I think Ireland has the 5th largest surplus. Cork probably, if it on its own, might be the 6th or 7th, given all the pharmaceuticals. So we're in a world where, to put it very crudely, countries are being mugged in a geopolitical way, and I think we as a nation, we're nice people, and we have a very sentimental view of the world, and we think, the Americans like us, they won't do anything untoward, and that just will not be the case. And I made the analogy of the diplomatic crash, and to extend that analogy, we as a country and our government need to think much more about risk management in our diplomatic choices. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to do something, calculate the probability that you will reach your outcome, calculate the risks, and then calculate what if something comes from the left field and goes wrong. So if you take our support for Palestine, which I think morally is great, the way we did that didn't really stop anyone being killed, and it didn't really. We didn't do other things like prepare the region for a coherent peace plan. And we didn't think through the possibility that an American president comes along and throws all of this out the window. So we have to tread much more carefully, I think, in this world. In terms of the trade and potential for tariffs, I actually think a lot of these businesses have chosen Ireland maybe they initially chose it because of tax, but they chose it because of regulation, labour, ease of doing business, and that's very, very sticky. So I personally don't think that a lot of these businesses will uproot themselves overnight. I think conditions can be made a lot more difficult. So I think there are other points of vulnerability. So one is regulation. So a lot of the social media firms are in Ireland because up until now, we have regulated them. And I think 75% of the regulatory judgments passed by the Irish regulator on the likes of Twitter and Facebook have to be changed. Their homework has to be corrected and made tougher by the EU regulator. And a lot of that stops now with the Digital Services Act and the EU AI Act. So that's, in my view, is probably a slightly more vulnerable point than tariffs on pharmaceuticals.
Andrew, I mean, you've touched on the defence implications for Ireland already, and our position in our neutral position. Is there risks there for us in this context?
Well, there is,
well?
and I think if we just think a little bit more about the Israel-Palestine-Gaza piece, what happens, which is perfectly conceivable, we don't know, but I mean, it seems conceivable, maybe even likely, if President Trump warns, if the Dáil passes the Occupied Territories Bill, the United States will impose some kind of diplomatic or economic or financial sanctions on Ireland. Then, the government, the Dáil, the Irish people have a difficult choice to make. And if you think about, just America is very big, Ireland's relatively small. The negative cost for America is little, but the cost for Ireland could be quite significant. And then, I do think, for me, in maybe the medium term, by which I mean maybe a 5-10 year perspective, Ireland's economic dependence on the US is quite heavy. The American multinationals have kind of been the go-to solution for Irish economic growth. And just in today's Financial Times, there was an article on Apple announcing $500 billion investment and 20,000 jobs in the United States. Now, that's not immediately taking anything away from Ireland. Ireland, Apple hasn't announced any, changes in relation to its operations in Ireland. But from a 5-10 year perspective, will the footprint of American multinational companies become smaller in Ireland? And how else does Ireland maintain jobs, maintain economic growth? So I think the Irish government has some serious thinking to do about can it promote indigenous companies? Can it develop trade and financial links with other European countries, obviously, but a country like Japan, perhaps as well, maybe Canada and so on. So I do think there is a medium 5-10 year term vulnerability there for Ireland.
And can I ask to be very slightly parochial about it, but the Taoiseach's St. Patrick's Day visit, are there things he can or should say or do during that period of time, not just with the President, but with the wider community, that would offset some of the risks you're describing, or at least give some indication that those are becoming real?
So I'll say two things diplomatically. I mean, I don't think he is well known enough in the Trump circles, and he probably doesn't have the forceful personality to go in there and to either demand something or to really charm Trump in the way Macron did. Yeah, Macron took quite a few risks yesterday, and it seems to have paid off at a very superficial level. And I think an Irish, the Taoiseach, whomever else, would actually be better off not going to Washington, but go to Chicago, Boston, New York, all the Irish American centres, and take the mood there, and reconnect with people, and just see, because I actually think with J.D. Vance, whatever you say about him, he wrote a very good book, and the Hillbilly Elegy, and the story of that book is how kind of lower class Americans shifted their allegiance from the Democrats to the Republicans, and a lot of those were Irish Americans. So trying to get the pulse of Irish America, whether they are still attached to Trump, and if not, what are their concerns, I think is a better way to spend his time.
Really interesting. Andrew, what's your thought on?
I think I shall continue with Mike's theme, but maybe be a little bit more off message. I think if I was the Taoiseach or the government or the Department of Foreign Affairs, if the invitation didn't arrive, I would breathe a sigh of relief. If you think about it bluntly, what are the hypothetical wins of going? Even a successful visit, gives you a minute, 5 minutes of optics on cable TV in America, and America moves on. On the other hand, the downside, President Trump decides, well, now's the time to raise Gaza. Now's the time to raise the fact that Ireland's effectively defenceless. So, there isn't much that the Taoiseach or the Irish government can do. And even the line, which Simon Harris and others have been pushing, which is correct, is that Ireland is a large foreign direct investor in the United States. This creates jobs in the United States. That's true, but it won't cut any ice with President Trump or the people in the Trump administration. So I'm British, to use a cricketing analogy, you're on a losing wicket. Is my view, I think.
We are already coming to the end of our discussion, and I have one very easy question to finally put to you both. And if I could ask you to put on your rose-tinted glasses for this one, in terms of perhaps reasons to be cheerful or hopeful, if not cheerful. What can we expect in November 2028? What do you see 5 years from now? Mike, on Europe and Ireland?
Okay. 2028, J.D. Vance will be president. Europe will be closer together. Ukraine will be close to EU membership. Ireland will be more European. We will be more comfortable with European as opposed to Anglophone culture, maybe more, and if I think of UCC, there'll be more students here from France, Germany and Italy, and we will speak well, a few more words of foreign languages. I hope Irish universities are much better funded, because I think in a world of crisis, education and informed thought is really valuable, and in particular for young people. So I hope the Irish universities are much better funded, and I think we will start to see a kind of a specialisation or a focus on excellence across the Irish universities. That UCC will be known for medicine, maybe for naval technology, because we may have the beginning of a new bigger Irish army. You'll have the young women and men officers being trained here. So that's maybe a slightly optimistic vision, I hope.
Yeah, I like the sound of that in terms of our global engagement plan, focusing on excellence and global citizenship and those wider really important value-based objectives that we have in that area. So Andrew, what are your reasons to be cheerful?
Okay, well unfortunately I'm going to give you a reason to be possibly more optimistic, but also I'm going to end on a pessimistic note, I'm afraid. The optimistic one is actually, for me, Europe and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The worst case scenario is that the US withdraws its support from Ukraine, Ukraine collapses, Russia takes over, Europe is weak and divided. President Putin has consistently, for decades in some senses, misunderstood and underestimated Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, and also Europe. So I think that so long as Europe stands with Ukraine, I think that Ukraine can survive. It's not going to be easy, but I think that Ukraine can survive, and I think that's probably the more likely scenario. So that's my optimistic one. My pessimistic one is America. It seems to me that there has to be a good chance that the Trump administration at some point in the next 4 years is going to implode. Government spending cuts, dismantling the federal government, trade tariffs that may trigger a major recession, possibility of large-scale political protests in response to some of what Trump is doing. Another outside possibility is some experts are saying that one of the things the Trump administration is doing, it will be to effectively gut the FBI, which will gut its counter-terrorism function, which would increase the risk of another 9/11 scale terrorist attack. We can't tell. There's kind of 4 or 5 seriously bad scenarios there. I don't know, but it just seems to me that there's a real possibility that the Trump administration will implode in some fairly bad way, given the way in which Trump and those around him are not restrained as they were first time round. How that will play out and where that will leave us, who knows?
It's certainly clear that, as you say, Mike, the role of the university in society, but also in creating opportunities for debate and discussion like this has never been more important. And I want to thank you both for giving so generously of your expertise and your time this evening, and for sharing all of your insights with us. And thanks very much. I'm going to pass back to Karen.
Thank you very much, Ursula, Mike and Andrew, for a very interesting and insightful discussion. You've covered a huge range of themes tonight and given us a lot to think about. We'd also like to thank everyone who has joined us online for tonight's discussion. We wish you a very nice evening from UCC, and we hope to connect with you soon again for the next Global Speaker Series discussion. Thank you.